Welcome, everybody, to the Connection Paradigm podcast, a podcast about love, connection, and the human experience. Today, we are talking about emotional connection versus emotional intimacy and how to build trust in relationships. We're joined by a special guest, Angela Heise, who is a human skills expert with over 27 years of experience in emotional productivity and leadership development. She is dedicated to helping individuals and organizations enhance communication, connection, and culture, fostering healthier relationships and more productive environments. Welcome to the show, Angela.
Thank you, Bianca. Hi, Kathy.
Hi,
Hi,
Angela.
Kathy.
This is really exciting, Angela, because you are our first guest speaker on our show. So this is very, very special. And, and Angela and I, how long have we known each other for, Angela?
6, 8
Sometime.
years, something like that.
Yeah, maybe even more, because I first met you when we were doing a course together, right, on learning how to broadcast.
Yes, we did
Yes.
our first Facebook Live ever together. Well, you had done one before, but I had never done one.
That's right. You were Facebook Live video virgin. I remember that. And look at you now with all your podcasts and all your, social media. Amazing. But Angela, I mean, thank you so much for coming on. You have so many incredible credentials. I also remember that at one stage you were working for, I think, a German TV network as well.
Yes.
And I remember my ears went up when you were talking about a program that you were creating, which was all about, was it sex? Love and sex, or?
I didn't create that. I just helped produce it, but it was
Right.
about love and sex. Yes.
Yes. And just, like back in those days when a lot of those topics that you were speaking about were quite taboo, I would imagine.
Oh, yeah.
We now find ourselves 8 years later talking about, emotional intimacy and emotions, which has been quite a taboo topic until recently. We have another guest here, guys. Go away, Ruby. So here we are.
I love it.
You got to be able to roll with the punches, right?
Absolutely.
All righty. So we're going to talk about this topic of emotional connection and emotional intimacy. So why don't we start, Angela, with, what is the difference between these two topics?
Well, you can have emotional connection with somebody really quickly and supposedly emotional intimacy as well. But I would say that one of them takes a bit longer to build because the key factor and the difference between both of those is trust. And connection is this thing that lays the groundwork, and intimacy deepens the trust through when people are really vulnerable. And that's not something that happens in the first hour. Although I have to say, there was an experiment, or I think you can actually still look it up. It's something about 36 questions that you ask somebody, and then you supposedly fall in love with each other after an hour of doing this.
Really? That's where we've been going wrong.
So there are all these questions. So if you could have anybody over for dinner, who would that be? And they become more progressively more and more intimate, and they build more and more trust. So if you wanted to try that out, it's fun. I mean, you could do that with each other and see what happens. You could do a podcast on that. But that's the difference. It's the ability to build trust. And yes, you can build trust really, really quickly with people, but then the intimacy helps when when you sustain that trust over a longer period of time. So that's really, really crucial. And it's the difference is also when you have that trust, you build the appreciation and the feeling valued into it. So I don't know about you, but I have sat on planes next to people and built great emotional connection with people, especially if it was a 10-hour flight.
I was going to say, I can think about all the questions you could ask. You could ask a lot more than 36 questions in that
Oh,
time.
yeah. But it doesn't create the emotional intimacy necessarily, unless, of course, some people think the fact that I'm a coach means they can basically tell me all of their deepest, darkest secrets in the first half hour.
Yeah, you
And
must
that has
have a
happened.
lot.
Yeah. So that's, and then we talk about boundaries, and that's a different topic.
Yeah, how fascinating.
You were mentioning about, the emotional connection can happen quite fast versus intimacy can take a long time. how does time come into this? Because I know that, when we are dating, we can kind of say, oh, well, we'll give these people 2 or 3 dates. But, I speak for myself when oftentimes it can take me quite a long time to develop emotional intimacy and a long time to develop trust.
Absolutely. And then it's really also a question of personality. If somebody is really an extrovert and gets, energy from connecting with other people, and somebody is not that much of an extrovert, and you don't need to be an introvert to be somebody who's a little bit more reserved. It just means that you protect yourself in a different way. And part of becoming emotionally and intimate is that ability to be vulnerable, to share more about yourself. And yes, you can do that very quickly. As I said, you can share, like story, like we have a lot of story in our lives. You can tell story very quickly. My life is because you can assign blame, you can tell drama stories, you can do all sorts of things. That doesn't necessarily create intimacy. That
Yes,
just creates that sense of, I know you. But for some people, that again, it can take a while, because I don't know about you, I don't want to talk about things that are really important to me in my first meeting with somebody.
no, you need to build up to that, don't you?
Yeah.
But also, like, I know that Bianca and I have spoken about this in quite a few of the podcasts. We find that so many people don't even ask you a question. And it's like, and so I know that I find myself asking so many questions because I'm trying to get to know someone.
Yeah.
So I can actually connect quite easily, but I'm not getting it back.
Mm.
And you just go, wow, I've walked away from that conversation. I don't know anything about that person. Yet I'm sure they know everything about me now. And, and as you said, the personality aspect is a huge one that comes into play for people to feel, I suppose, safe to, be able to open up to you. It's those walls that can often just come up in these conversations, right? So it's
Yeah.
a tricky one.
Yeah. The thing is, when we get into these situations where somebody asks a lot of questions, when people perceive that there's genuine interest and that the person wants to know about us, one of our core needs is to be heard. And I know that you've covered that in your previous podcast. I don't know which one it was, but this thing about actually being listened to without being interrupted, without having somebody make a suggestion immediately or share their story, like, oh, you'd give me part of your story, now I give you some back. And so when somebody really listens and asks questions that prompt that diving deeper, that going more into more intimate details, people feel really honored, or they feel excited. And that then opens the floodgates. And I have literally been, and I know you have too, been on dates and, and meetings with people where, like you, they would tell me all sorts of things. And then at the end of the meeting, they would say, gosh, you're a fabulous listener.
Yeah. Or I had
And
a
they just
fabulous
ask,
time, but then you
yeah,
go, but I don't know anything about you. It's always they've
What
had a
about
fabulous
me?
time.
yeah. And
Exactly.
they
What
don't know
about me?
nothing about me, nothing,
Mm.
you know? So
How do we
it's,
work around that one? Because I try to zip my mouth to let them and go, but you're sitting there going, waiting, nothing's coming. Okay, then I need to continue on.
Do you
I
think
have,
that's do you think that's sort of an ignorance, or do you think that is maybe potentially a blockage for somebody?
blockage for the person listening or for the person speaking?
For the person who wouldn't be asking the questions?
I don't, it could be a blockage, but it could also be, again, this whole thing of, I mean, yes, that all sorts of reasons. The person is so self-absorbed and so narcissistic, they don't realize that they are the only ones talking. So, I mean, I can really only generalize in this context. Or they are just so relieved that they finally have an opportunity to talk about themselves. Or again, something has happened in their life, just on that day, potentially, they absolutely urgently need to talk about, and it just opens up, it creates that domino effect when somebody then goes, wow, that sounds stressful, that sounds really challenging, and it just goes from there. So there are all sorts of reasons. But the thing is, I do this now because Kathy knows this. I'm really, really firm on boundaries. And I don't mind setting boundaries fairly early in the piece, because I know that if we don't set the boundaries, and we need to do this all the time, boundaries we need to pretty much set even when we know people really well, every single day. Sometimes it's unexpressed, it's just might be a gesture or a look or something, and sometimes you really need to say something. And so if you don't know somebody and you're on a first date and the person keeps talking on and on, I have said to the person, would you like to know something about me?
That's a good one. I've got to remember that.
What do you have any questions for me?
I usually say, do you have any questions for me? Yeah.
Yeah. And the thing is, the important thing I think is that you don't come from that place of hurt child. There's I haven't, like when you cross your arms and you go, you haven't asked me a single question, and when is the time? But it's I really loved hearing about you. Do you have any questions for me?
Yeah.
When it comes from that same kind of empathetic place of, yes, I really appreciated you sharing all of this. Now I'd like to share something about me.
Yeah, I remember I had a partner though at once who I used to bring that up, and his response was, well, you'll just tell me whatever I need to know. And I said, no, that's not the same thing. Well, how this makes me feel when you don't ask me is you don't care. That's how it makes me feel.
Okay.
And, was that wrong to do that?
I always, and this is my thing, I have a really big antibody response around the expression, you make me feel, because it automatically assigns blame. We're not responsible for other people's emotions. We can trigger somebody and then we can negotiate that. We can say, when I hear you say this, or when I see you do that, I feel, may I make a request? But it's when you say that, you make me feel, it's the person automatically goes into defense mode.
Right. Okay.
I mean, it's such a small change in the words.
Yeah, it's so subtle.
The execution is so important because, like you can see how when you say you make me feel, it's the blame on you, and it's this what happened made me feel, and then it's sort of like, well, I take responsibility. Well, you said it perfectly, but to be able to bring that emotional awareness into a conversation, it's a challenge, but it makes the world of difference. So many people, and I'm seeing this time and time again, and I'm sure I've done this as well. We get into the inner child defense mode. We're like, don't tell me what to do. It's not my fault. I didn't do this. I didn't do this to you. And then all of a sudden you've lost the connection.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yes. And so again, it's that sense of, I'm accountable for my feelings and you're accountable for yours. And then we talk about needs and boundaries and emotions. So that's, for me, that's my tripod. It's like you need to know about your emotions, your needs, and your boundaries. And that's like the three-legged stool. If you're not aware of your emotions, it's going to start wobbling. If you're not aware of your boundaries, it's going to definitely start wobbling. And when you don't know about your needs, then you're probably not aware of your emotions either, because every unpleasant emotion has an unfulfilled need, and every pleasant emotion has a fulfilled need attached to it. So when we start negotiating that, and when we start talking about this, and we're open about what's really important to us, then we can shift the conversation completely. And then when we say, I feel, and this is my boundary, and this is my need, then we become more accountable, we become more respectful, we become more appreciative, and that then builds emotional intimacy.
Yeah, and there's a big sense of trust that's been created.
Exactly.
And you make it sound so easy though, Angela.
Wait, so in Kathy's situation, let's go back to, so you said
when I'm not asked questions. Oh, is that what you mean?
And what did they say back to you?
The response was, I don't need to ask you questions. You'll tell me what you need to tell me.
Right. And then you said that makes you feel unheard.
Unheard, not considered, undervalued.
And so the right way, or a way to create more emotional intimacy would have been.
Yeah. Okay, so look, let me put it this way. There is no formula. And if I could give everybody a script on what to say in any kind of situation, I'd be
You'd
a
be a very rich woman.
We wouldn't be very authentic. Wait a minute, I have to get my
Yes.
now.
But you could, I would generally, if somebody said this to me, and I would feel they would probably, I don't know about you, but maybe you felt a little bit upset about that. Yeah.
Of course I felt upset, but I was trying to deliver it in a kind, more neutral way. But now I'm feeling really bad about how I've delivered it.
Well, let me put it this way. It's looking back and saying I made a mistake is one thing. Saying, okay, I now know what didn't work. I'm going to do this differently next time, different story. So my suggestion would be if you find yourself, it's either you or the other person or both of you are emotionally upset in a situation, don't have that conversation right then and there. Because your brain function will be not geared towards the best outcome.
Yeah.
When we get really upset and we produce adrenaline, all the blood in the head goes into the arms and the legs so we can fight harder and run faster. So especially the middle prefrontal cortex, which has all the highest cognitive functions, there will be no blood in there. There's no oxygen that allows you to make those rational decisions and say things that you don't regret afterwards, where you can say, you know what, that's going on. Leave it. Come back half an hour later, come back the next day and say maybe something like, you know, that conversation we had earlier. You know, I hear that you want me to just tell you what's going on instead of asking me questions. I find that a bit difficult because I'm not a mind reader. I don't really know what you know about me and what you don't. And I would really, you know, I would prefer if you ask me questions because then we're both clear on what we know about each other. And
Yeah,
it's
I
really
see the difference.
And it's really important to me that we have that reciprocity as well, so that we can get to this place of being able to share. And depending on the person and the sense of humor, and it's like, you know, I don't like to pull things out or, you know, just vomit things out when I don't know what it is that you really want to know. And, you know, it's just making clear that you have your needs also to be heard. You also have a need to be respected and appreciated, and asking questions is one of the greatest tools we have to increase respect and appreciation.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. It's really about making it about yourself, really taking all the emphasis off the other person and just bringing it back to yourself, right? To neutralize them becoming defensive and
while acknowledging that the person, you know, thinks they might they think they might do you a favor. You know, and then you mentioned that in a previous podcast about avoidance. You know, so if I don't ask questions, then I avoid potentially difficult conversations. Because
yes.
maybe if I ask questions and you share something with me that I don't really want to hear, ooh, or
Yeah.
I ask a question that you don't want to answer, ooh, that could get
Yeah.
difficult. So I'll just give you the whole responsibility. There you go.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought about it that way, actually, but that makes perfect sense, isn't it? You know, this whole topic around difficult conversations, they don't have to be difficult, do they? But then there are so many people who just want to avoid at all costs.
Well, you did a whole episode on ghosting, didn't you?
Yes. Yes,
The
that's right.
preferred way of dealing with difficult conversations these days. I
Yeah,
just disconnect. Yeah.
that's right.
Well, this kind of brings up the topic of emotional vulnerability. And you were talking about, you know, how we can navigate some of the challenges of emotional vulnerability in a world where that often values emotional independence and self-sufficiency. You know, we're kind of feeling as though that we need to take on everything in our own little corner of the world. And in our ghosting episode, we did talk a lot of the reason why people ghost is that because they almost just don't feel that they have the courage to say what needs to be said, which is actually an emotionally vulnerable thing, just to say, hey, I had a nice time with you, but I don't feel a connection here. And that's really such a beautiful, simple thing, but it can be so hard for people. So what are your thoughts about that?
Well, there are a couple of misconceptions people have around vulnerability. And one is that vulnerability has to feel good all the time. And that's the problem, is we think that vulnerability is, and this is if you look it up in the dictionary definition says not feeling safe. It's a risk, it's a danger, right?
Mm.
So being opening up to somebody and saying I'm feeling vulnerable can be very risky. And I actually had a conversation with a friend of mine just last week, I think. So he runs a men's group and he uses some of my materials. And he said, I would never ask a man to feel vulnerable or to acknowledge that he feels vulnerable. Why? Because it's so risky, because people pounce and, and I said, hang on, vulnerability is a strength, not a weakness. And he says, yeah, no.
Yeah, men definitely do not see that as a
No.
strong word. They see it
No, they
as the
don't.
opposite, don't they?
Because they have learned over the years that, you get labeled all sorts of uncomplimentary things if you show any kind of vulnerability. But what you can do is, and this is when we talk about vulnerability, emotional vulnerability, the first person who needs to acknowledge that you feel emotionally vulnerable is at first recognize it's a strength, and then start feeling how you feel. So Bianca said that in a previous episode, notice how you're feeling in your body. Maybe for you that could be like your throat is closed up, or you have that sense of barbed wire wrapped all around you all of a sudden, or anything like that. So when you start noticing that, then you already have choice. And then you can decide whether you want to go more into vulnerability or whether you put a boundary into place and say, you know what, this is how far I go. And that's okay. Has that answered your question?
It has, and it also raised another point when you spoke about boundaries. So the difference between like boundary with self and boundary with other. Because you're saying in this situation with emotional vulnerability, you're almost having to check in with yourself first before you take that step, rather than notice who you're actually going to be vulnerable with.
Yeah.
I haven't really thought about that before. I often think, is this safe for me to be vulnerable with X or with Y, rather than, hey, Bianca, like, are we safe to be vulnerable right now? And do we want to? And yeah, so that's what came up for me.
Yeah. So for me, I learned all of this the hard way. I mean, I was very lucky. Forgive, this is not sarcasm. I mean, I was really lucky to come from a very dysfunctional family. And I learned all of these things the hard way. And I know that I had this whole lack of connection in my youth. I was in lots of contexts, I was the youngest. And so people didn't take me seriously. So nobody would really connect with me on that level. In my family, it was all about children are there to be seen but not heard. And so I never got that sense of actually belonging anywhere. So when I met people, and this is why I know this whole thing of somebody opens the door, just a crack, and I would barrel through that door and I would open it up and people would have my life story in a really short period of time. And I thought I built connection and emotional vulnerability and all of that. But what I would find is, and thankfully it didn't take me that long to learn, because I started working on myself at a fairly young age. But it was like, oh, people are overwhelmed with that level of information. They don't know how to handle that kind of, and I don't know, I'm just giving you a basic example. And then, this is the addiction problem, or this is or this is the boundaryless problem, or this is the relationship problem that I've encountered, or, whatever it might be, or like I keep having the same boss over and over again. My boss is terrible. I mean, I worked with my father 3 times before I got the message, but we get into this drama and into this story, and we think, I mean, I thought that was the way to build connection. If I just told people about all the dreaded things that have happened in my life, the terrible things, that people would then understand why and how I am the way I am. And it doesn't do that. What it does, it gets people to really take a big step back and go, whoa, if they're healthy. If they're not, then we will start engaging in that really unhealthy context. And when people will start, again, we will start creating more dysfunction because we tap into all of those old family patterns. And that doesn't serve anyone.
Yeah, I can really relate to that. I have definitely been through that.
That's
So,
why it's so important. And I'm so grateful that you're doing this podcast, because these are all the things that we are supposed to know. And we learn all automatically through life experiences. But, if everybody around us is in the same trance and we all operate through all of these unconscious patterns, nobody can change it, because we're swimming in the same soup,
yeah,
right?
it's like we're all speaking different languages and, and no one can understand each other.
Or we understand each other, but the language is so difficult that it makes communication really impossible, because it operates on all sorts of factors outside of that communication, mind reading,
Mm.
shared beliefs,
Yeah.
like this is the way the world's supposed to be. All of these things that create that whole paradigm of what is communication and what is connection.
Yeah. Wow. It's so deeply intertwined, isn't it?
Mm.
All of this. Well, I think we've covered off boundaries there really well, actually. But it is amazing how many people don't know they don't even acknowledge their own needs. So if you don't know what that is, how can you create boundaries?
Yeah. No, you can't. I mean, I had a client, and this is the thing, is especially with family. I know that we're talking about partners as well, but a lot of the time what we act out with partners also comes from the family of origin. So I had a client whose mother would show up every night. They lived around the corner. Every night she would show up at 5:30 at night when she was feeding her 3-year-old and her 1-year-old. And I don't know if you've ever fed a baby, but if you feed two toddlers, two babies, and you have a mother sitting in the corner who wants full attention, who starts crying and starts saying, "You don't love me, you're not giving me any kind of attention." This woman was absolutely, she was a nervous wreck. Every time and mother wouldn't ring the doorbell, she would just walk in. So for her to establish boundaries was, because her mother did a lot of things for her as well, was really, really hard. But what she felt, and we talked about this, there was no connection. There was just protection. Mom would walk in and she would immediately get into the defensive, because she couldn't fulfill her mom's needs, she couldn't fulfill her children's needs, and she definitely couldn't fulfill her own needs. And because when we have children, these needs come first, right? So she was feeling that she was not really serving anybody. So we put boundaries in place with mom, who immediately had a hissy fit. I mean, we're talking massive proportions of, "I don't want to have anything to do with you anymore because you clearly don't appreciate me." And I had to say, I had prepared my clients for that. And it was "I'm really sorry that you feel this way. That is not my intent. My intent is for us to have more trust and more connection. And what we have right now isn't really working. Could we please talk about how we can do this differently? 5:30 is not a good time for me. Could we find out different time where it works better?" Mom disappeared for a couple of weeks, came back and said, "You actually have a point."
Wow, I was going to ask you, how is their relationship now? So it's definitely on the improve.
Yeah. Yes. But they
Mm.
had to, obviously, when these are really old patterns, when people are so used to doing things a certain way, one conversation is not going to do it. And that's one of the problems that I see, is that people think that they have one conversation and it's done. The person now knows what's going on. I have now created that connection and that intimacy, and everything is good. You have to actually repeat this several times.
I mean, it
And
could take years, right? Depending on, like, especially if there's trauma involved, the trauma has to be dealt with as well. And so, yeah, these things can take a long, long time.
my recommendation is if you think that it's going to take a long time, get professional support.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
when you are stuck in that kind of bubble, what you do is you can recreate that over and over again. Then it's good to have outside support who says, "Have you noticed that you actually keep doing the same thing? We've had this conversation several times, and this is the behavior that I've observed." Because when we are stuck in this, we often don't know that that's what we're doing.
Yeah. Our families are really usually our best teachers, aren't they, Angela?
Oh, yeah.
They're the ones that give us the hardest lessons.
And the
I was
best.
actually talking to a friend today about how one of the hardest things is to assert or say your boundaries to someone who doesn't necessarily, is not maybe ready to hear it, and they go into defense mode. And we've been in a situation where my friend is saying to me, I know the things that I want to say, and I feel like they're not going to be received. And in that case, we were reflecting and saying, well, sometimes the longer you keep it in, the longer it sits with you. I mean, if in your friend, in that woman's example, if she never said anything, you know, what's worse, to carry that with you day after day because you feel guilty about how the other person's really going to react, or to say in a kind way, these are my boundaries. You know, at the end of the day, we can't control the way that the other person is going to
No.
react.
This is
The
what
thing-
leads to disease, you know, so
Oh,
much
yeah.
disease when people don't express themselves.
Well, I mean, you look at the word dis-ease,
Disease. Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Yeah, my client actually, and I find that with a lot of clients, when we work together and we establish boundaries in one area of life, there's a domino effect because people start setting boundaries in other areas of their life as well. So people get promoted. I had one client who set boundaries differently at home and then started setting boundaries at work automatically and got promoted, which for her didn't make any sense because she said, I'm working less. How does that work? Well, you're working differently. Yeah, so I always suggest to people, start working on something in one area of your life and notice how it flows through the other areas.
Yeah.
And I think ultimately then that fosters more trust. If, you know, you're kind of doing this dance with somebody and then, you know, you've got your boundaries and eventually you get to that place where you can feel more of a sense of trust.
Yeah.
We talked a bit about trust in the beginning of the episode, but what advice would you have for people that might be struggling with trusting others and reaching that kind of emotional intimacy?
Take it slowly. Just take it step by step. As they say, Rome wasn't built in one day. No, it's like, and trust your intuition and trust yourself. If something doesn't feel safe, it probably isn't. Unless you know that sense of I'm wrapping myself in barbed wire right now, and that's a protection mechanism. And so that is generally when you've done some work on yourself and you realize what's a healthy pattern and what's not a healthy pattern. But once you know the difference, it's really easy to say, you know what? Again, this is how far I go. This is how much I'm willing to share. This is how much I'm willing to trust. And always remember, you are the person who needs to trust yourself the most. If you're overriding your internal trust mechanisms just to please somebody else or to connect with somebody, come hell or high water, because you know you want that, and this need to be liked and to be appreciated and to be approved of. When you recognize that you drop your boundaries for that and you start trusting when there's no valid reason to trust, take a step back. But again, as I said, just go slowly, you know, develop that ability and feel what it's like to trust somebody. Notice really, what does it feel like when I trust somebody? Think about all the different relationships that you have. Go to the ones where you feel that you can actually talk to this person about maybe not everything, because you don't need to talk about everything, but about most of the things that are really important to you. And then compare that with people you don't want to share things with. And notice how that feels differently in your body, and notice what kind of filtering mechanisms do you have in place. Do you stop talking? Do you walk away? What else can you do? How can you change that? You know, maybe if it's just you, you recognize that it's your barbed wire at that point. The person has actually been open with you. Maybe just open the door just a little bit wider, but never because you want to be liked. Never.
Yeah, that's always a recipe for disaster, that one, isn't it? To do something because you just want to be accepted and liked. But why is it, you know, we're living in this world at the moment where there just seems to be so many trust issues and, you know, and people, is it a societal thing where we would just have been so conditioned to not feel, you know? I remember you showing me that app, Angela. What was that called? Feelings? The app
Yeah.
which is all about people, you know, they give people a way to tune into their emotions, because when someone is really bad at that, they don't even have a word to, they don't understand. So I think you tap on a button and to help you identify what you're feeling.
Yeah.
Remember that?
Yes, there's several apps these days, and they come and go. So
Right.
yeah. The reason I think trust is diminishing, and I mean, there's so many different factors, but have a look at social media. We do not know what is real and what isn't. You can look at somebody's profile and they on the yacht and they live the lifestyle. And, when you start talking to them, they're supremely unhappy. The yacht is not theirs. They, like you don't know what's real and what isn't. The same goes with news. Now we have all these apps where you don't even know if the person you're talking to is real or not, if they're an AI or not. So, and we live in environments where we don't know our neighbors. I don't know about you, but I mean, I moved specifically to where I live now because I wanted to build a community. I was tired of living in places where I didn't know the neighbors. And if I made an effort to go and say, I've just moved in, would you like to come over and have a cup of coffee or have a drink or maybe even a dinner, which is, whoa, that could be too
Yeah.
much. No, I'm committing here for 2 hour meeting. Oh, no, no. People would go, yeah, no, thank you. And they would never show up. And this is one of the reasons, if we're just keeping ourselves isolated all the time, then we can't build that trust. And then we expect that when we meet somebody on a date and we share half our life story with them in the first hour, well, that surely builds trust. But it isn't. So my recommendation is always build a community. And it doesn't happen overnight. You actually have to invest into showing up, being dependable, being reliable, walking your talk, being, giving to the other person, listening so they feel heard, they feel supported. It doesn't mean that you have to uproot your whole life and be there for the person, but it's about giving. And a lot of the time these days, people don't want to give because we're just so afraid that we're going to get hurt or that the person will take advantage of us. So build yourself a community. You don't need to have 500,000 friends on Facebook. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about people you can call. Like I had to go to hospital the other day, and I had my friend and my neighbor drove me, you know, and she would call and say, "Are you okay? When are you ready to be picked up? Let me know." And I knew I could totally rely on her. And for the next few days when I was at home, I would get 2 text messages, "Are you okay? Do you need anything?" Yeah,
Yeah, sometimes that community can be stronger than your own family. And that's,
absolutely.
yeah, I mean, Bianca and I have had a lot of conversations about this, and I think it was only just yesterday, right, Bianca, we were talking about how we feel that community is the foundation for everything, really, and especially how we cannot separate community from connection. They
Yeah.
are definitely going, hand in hand. But I know for myself, when I've been in personal relationships, whether it be with friends, not so much friends, probably more partners, where they could not understand my need for community.
Mm,
And I said to them that, if you cannot understand this need for me, this is who I am. And it was really hard for them to understand that. But now I look back at it and I look at these partners that made those comments, and they were very much partners who didn't have trust. They severely lacked trust.
yeah.
And that was their whole attitude towards life. So it was, related to fear and that their safety, and they felt that, they couldn't have community because how can we trust any of these people, So we'll just keep putting up our walls around us.
Well, I think it's important to remember that men have learned that showing emotional vulnerability is a risky thing. So what they have learned is that, I mean, again, I'm completely generalizing, and I know younger men don't operate like that, but older men specifically, they feel that the only emotional vulnerability and the only emotional connection and intimacy is the only person they can have that with is their partner.
And then they get it mixed up anyway with sexual intimacy.
Yes, or
They,
that's a whole other podcast.
yes,
I
yeah,
mean, we can
that's
talk
right.
about that for another hour or two. But it's that whole responsibility. And when you said I need community, I need more than one person in my life. I cannot have the responsibility for being the only person you connect to. And I had a client who was working on all of his boundaries and all of his needs, and his wife left him. and his whole world collapsed. And he committed suicide because
Oh,
he wasn't, I mean, I had only worked with him I only had a couple of sessions, and I just didn't know him that well yet. We hadn't reached that point of, I'll share things with you, because even in a coaching or therapy connection, you need to build that trust, right? And it's not the only time. I've heard this numerous times, that when women get out of a relationship, they often have community that supports them.
yeah.
But
We've got
when
the
men get out of
sisterhood.
Hmm?
We've got the sisterhood.
Exactly. When men leave a relationship, they don't. They do not have a community around them that supports them and that helps them, with that emotional vulnerability and with that intimacy that allows them to say, you know what, this really sucks.
And
Yeah, it's very.
I feel like self-isolation is a very steep slope.
Mm.
Because, once you get there, once you're in that place of, I'm the only safe space for me, I can't trust anybody, it's a very lonely journey. And to find your way out of that takes a lot of work with self, takes a lot of, like you said, finding your people, finding those people, and opening your heart up again to them, because don't forget, your heart becomes closed.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And I just I really value what you mentioned about social media and the lack of authenticity on there. And I think, we've built this big global world with globalization and connecting with one another from all across the world, but you can have 7,000 Facebook friends or 100,000 followers. How many of those people actually know you?
Mm.
So I really feel that one of the answers is to bring it back to the micro, bring it back to the community, the local communities, the people in your circle, like who's in your circle.
Yeah. The
Yeah,
thing
who
is,
got your back? Yeah.
it takes time.
Mm.
And it's so much easier to read somebody's Facebook post and put a like or a love on it, and then move on to the next, or even say, so sorry that's happening to you, or yay, go you. That doesn't create that connection. But it's that fakeness, that kind of, we think it's connection.
Yeah,
It
it's
isn't.
very superficial, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not intimacy.
No.
Well, thank you so much, Angela, for coming on the show. It was very insightful. I definitely learned a lot, and thank you for sharing the stories.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for doing what you're doing. I think it's so important, and such a great contribution.
Well, thanks, Angela. And of course, your work that you're doing is amazing. So we may have to take you up on your offer. Was that an offer that we heard a moment ago about another podcast episode with you about the sexual intimacy side?
Well, I'm sure we can make that happen. But since I was the first guest, how about we do the same thing to others? But thank you. No, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
And
All
for
right,
our
Angela.
listeners, I'll put some of the information that we spoke about today in the show notes.
Yes, and a link to where people can find Angela if they would like to get in touch with her for more about her work.
And if people are interested, I have a quiz on my website that you can do that is all about the human skills that we have or not have, or that we can work on. And I give people a complimentary session, half-hour session, where we can look into those results and see if there's anything that I can add value to.
Yes, that's right. Wonderful. Well, thank you again, Angela. That's absolutely fantastic.
Thanks, ladies. Bye for now.
Bye.